He thought she didn't belong in a place like this, but by tomorrow morning, he would realize he had just insulted the wrong woman. The glass doors of the dealership slid open with a soft mechanical whisper as Olivia Hayes stepped inside, her reflection briefly stretching across the polished marble floors beneath her worn sneakers, the kind that had seen years of quiet errands and unremarkable days. And for a moment, the world inside that showroom seemed to pause just long enough to notice her and dismiss her just as quickly. Because nothing about Olivia fit the image that place had carefully curated, not the tailored suits, not the gleaming watches, not the effortless confidence that floated through the air like expensive cologne. And yet she walked forward anyway, her posture calm, her expression steady, as if she had every right to be there, even when no one else believed it. The sunlight poured through the tall glass walls, catching the curves of million-dollar vehicles lined in perfect symmetry, each one reflecting a life of status and privilege, and Olivia's eyes moved across them slowly, not with awe, but with a quiet familiarity that no one bothered to notice, because from a distance, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place by accident, someone who might ask for directions, or worse, someone who might waste time, and in a business built on appearances. That was the worst offense of all. Across the showroom, Jason Miller adjusted his tie as he spotted her, his trained instincts kicking in instantly, the subtle narrowing of his eyes revealing a judgment he had made 1,000 times before, a silent calculation of worth based on nothing more than fabric and posture. And as he began walking toward her, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor, there was already a faint smirk forming at the corner of his lips, the kind reserved for situations he believed he had already mastered. Olivia paused beside a midnight blue coupe, her fingers hovering just inches from the sleek surface, not touching, just observing, as though she understood something deeper than what was visible. And for a brief second, there was something in her gaze, something precise, something knowing, but it vanished the moment Jason's voice cut through the air. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his tone smooth but edged with something colder, something rehearsed. And Olivia turned to face him, offering a small, polite smile that carried no trace of intimidation, no hint of apology for being there. "Yes," she said gently, her voice calm. "I'd like to learn more about this model." Jason's eyes flicked from her face to her clothes and back again, the pause just long enough to be noticed, just short enough to remain deniable, and then he exhaled lightly, as if humoring her. "This one," he replied, gesturing casually toward the car. "It's a limited edition. Most people schedule private appointments to view it." The words hung in the air, subtle but deliberate, and somewhere behind them, a pair of sales associates exchanged glances, their expressions barely concealing amusement, because in that moment, Olivia had become something else entirely. Not a customer, not a guest, but a spectacle. Still, she didn't react, didn't shrink, didn't argue. She simply nodded once, her eyes returning briefly to the car, as if the conversation hadn't changed anything at all. And that was what unsettled him most, because people like her were supposed to hesitate, to explain, to prove themselves, and yet she did none of that. She just stood there, steady and composed, as if the judgment surrounding her meant nothing. And in that quiet stillness, something invisible shifted, something Jason didn't yet understand, something that would follow him long after this moment had passed, though for now, all he saw was a woman who didn't belong, standing in a place that was never meant for her, and he was about to make sure she knew it. Jason let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it carried no warmth, only a quiet impatience that had been building the moment Olivia stepped through the door, and he shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself just enough to block her view of the car, as if creating a boundary that did not need to be spoken aloud, because in places like this, the rules were rarely written but always understood, and he had decided, within seconds, that she was not part of the story he wanted to entertain today. "Look," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound polite, while still allowing the nearby staff to hear. "These vehicles are not exactly casual purchases," and his eyes flicked once more to her shoes, then to the simple fabric of her shirt, completing the sentence without actually finishing it, because implication was often more powerful than words. A faint chuckle came from somewhere behind the reception desk, quickly stifled but not quickly enough, and Olivia heard it. Of course she did. But her expression did not change. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her breathing steady, as if she had been in rooms like this before, as if she knew exactly how these moments unfolded. And that knowledge gave her a stillness that felt almost out of place in a room built on constant motion and persuasion. "I understand," she replied softly, her voice even. "I am still interested in learning about it." And there was no challenge in her tone, no defensiveness, just a simple statement that refused to shrink. And for a fraction of a second, something in Jason's expression tightened, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not do. She did not apologize. She did not explain herself. She did not try to prove that she belonged. And that quiet confidence disrupted the rhythm he was used to controlling. He straightened his tie again, a habitual gesture, and this time his smile was sharper, more deliberate. "We typically reserve detailed walkthroughs for serious clients," he said, emphasizing the last two words just enough to draw a line in the air between them. And now a couple browsing nearby turned their attention more openly, sensing the tension that had begun to settle like a thin layer of dust over the polished space. Olivia glanced briefly at the car once more, her eyes tracing its lines with the same quiet focus, and then she nodded again, as if acknowledging something far deeper than the conversation itself, and that only seemed to irritate him further, because it felt as though she was not affected in the way he expected. "Maybe you would be more comfortable exploring options in a different price range," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward a far corner of the showroom that held older models, his voice now carrying just enough volume to make the suggestion public. And that was when the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a subtle tightening of attention, the kind that happens when people sense a boundary being enforced. Olivia turned her gaze back to him, and for the first time, there was a pause, not hesitation, but consideration, as if she were deciding whether the moment deserved more of her energy. And then she spoke again, just as calmly as before. "I asked about this car," she said, and the simplicity of her words seemed to echo more than any raised voice could have, because it stripped away the performance and left only the truth of the situation standing in the open. Jason's patience thinned, the polite veneer beginning to crack at the edges, and he took a small step closer, his voice dropping again, but carrying a sharper edge now. "And I answered you," he replied. "This is not something you can just walk in and browse without the proper arrangements." And there it was, the final shift from suggestion to dismissal, from subtle implication to clear exclusion. And a few feet away, one of the younger sales associates looked down at his tablet, avoiding eye contact, while another pretended to adjust a display, because no one wanted to be the one to interrupt what had now become unmistakably uncomfortable. Olivia stood there for a moment longer, the silence stretching just enough to make the air feel heavier. And then, without a word of protest, she let out a quiet breath and gave a small nod, not of defeat, but of decision, as if she had reached a conclusion that no one else in the room could see yet. And she turned away from the car, her steps measured, unhurried, carrying herself toward the exit with the same calm presence she had entered with, while behind her, Jason exhaled again, satisfied that the situation had been handled, unaware that the stillness she left behind was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something he had completely misjudged. And as the glass doors opened once more to let her out into the bright afternoon light, the showroom returned to its usual rhythm. Conversations resumed, footsteps echoed, but beneath it all, something had shifted, something quiet and inevitable, like the first moment before a storm that no one sees coming. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had any right to be, casting long reflections across the rows of parked vehicles as Olivia stepped onto the pavement, the glass doors sealing shut behind her with a quiet finality that seemed to echo longer than it should have. And for a brief moment, she stood still, not out of hesitation, but out of thought, her gaze drifting across the dealership's facade, as if memorizing something invisible to everyone else, something deeper than the polished surfaces and curated luxury, because what had just happened inside was not new to her, not unfamiliar, and certainly not unexpected. It was simply another variation of a pattern she had seen too many times before, one where assumptions were made quickly and respect was given selectively, and yet there was no anger in her expression, no frustration in her posture, only a calm acceptance that carried a quiet weight, as if she understood that moments like this always revealed more about others than they ever could about her. A light breeze brushed past, lifting a strand of her hair as she reached into her bag, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and she pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up softly in her hand, and for a second, she simply looked at it, her reflection faintly visible against the glass, before she tapped a name without hesitation, holding it to her ear as the line began to ring. Once, twice, and then a voice answered on the other end, steady, familiar, carrying a warmth that stood in quiet contrast to everything she had just left behind. "Hey," the voice said, and Olivia's lips curved into the faintest smile, one that never needed to be seen to be understood. "Hi," she replied, her tone just as calm as before, but now softened by something more personal, something grounded. "Are you busy tomorrow morning?" There was a brief pause on the line, not confusion, but consideration, followed by a quiet chuckle. "I can make time," he said, and she nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. "Good," she continued, her gaze lifting once more toward the dealership windows, where her reflection stood small against the vast display of luxury behind it. "I need your help with something." Another pause, this one shorter, more curious. "What kind of help?" he asked, and Olivia let her eyes linger on the showroom for just a second longer, the memory of voices, of glances, of subtle dismissals still fresh in the air, though none of it seemed to weigh on her, not in the way anyone inside might have expected. "Just trust me," she said quietly. "It will not take long." On the other end there was a soft exhale, the kind that came with understanding rather than hesitation. "All right," he replied. "Tell me where and when." Olivia stepped forward then, her shoes brushing lightly against the pavement as she began to walk, leaving the dealership behind without a second glance, not because it did not matter, but because she already knew it would, just not in the way anyone inside imagined. "Tomorrow," she said, "around 10 in the morning." And then, after a brief pause that felt almost intentional, she added, "The same place." The line went quiet for a second, and then a low, knowing tone slipped into his voice. "I see," he said, and though no explanation had been given, none was needed, because there was a shared understanding between them, something unspoken yet precise, like a plan forming without ever being announced. Olivia ended the call a moment later, slipping the phone back into her bag as she continued down the sidewalk, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, and behind her, the dealership remained exactly as it had been, polished, confident, unaware, but somewhere within its walls, the echo of that quiet encounter lingered, unnoticed but not insignificant, like a ripple that had yet to reveal how far it would travel. And as the sunlight shifted slightly, reflecting off the glass in a brighter, almost blinding shimmer, it felt as though the stage had already been set, the roles already defined, and all that remained was for the next day to arrive, bringing with it a moment no one inside was prepared to face, not because it would be loud or dramatic, but because it would be undeniable, and sometimes that was far more powerful than anything they had ever expected. The next morning arrived with a quiet certainty that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had slowed just enough to make space for what was about to unfold, and inside the dealership, nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The same polished floors reflecting the early light, the same lineup of luxury vehicles standing in perfect formation, and the same rhythm of business beginning to take shape as staff moved with practiced efficiency, greeting clients, adjusting displays, maintaining the illusion of effortless exclusivity. And Jason Miller stood near the center of it all, reviewing numbers on his tablet, his posture confident, his expression composed, already focused on the day ahead and the potential sales that mattered, because to him, yesterday had already faded into something insignificant, just another brief interruption in an otherwise predictable routine. A few customers filtered in, their conversations low, their movements unhurried, and the atmosphere settled into its usual cadence until, from outside, a sound cut through the morning air, not loud, not abrupt, but distinct enough to draw attention, the deep, smooth hum of an engine that carried a presence unlike anything else on the lot, and one by one, heads turned subtly toward the glass walls, curiosity pulling their focus without a word being spoken. The vehicle came into view slowly, gliding across the entrance with a kind of effortless authority, its polished exterior catching the sunlight in a way that seemed almost deliberate. And as it came to a stop directly in front of the dealership, the quiet inside shifted, conversations trailing off, movements pausing mid-step, because even in a place filled with luxury, there are certain things that still command attention, and this was one of them. Jason glanced up, his brow tightening slightly as he registered the car, a Rolls Royce that stood apart even among the high-end inventory surrounding it. And for a brief second, something flickered across his face, not concern, not yet, but recognition of something that did not fit neatly into his expectations for the morning. The driver's door remained closed for just a moment longer than usual, long enough for the silence inside to deepen, and then it opened with controlled precision, and a man stepped out, his presence immediately altering the space without a single word, his suit tailored to perfection, his posture relaxed but unmistakably confident. The kind of confidence that did not need to prove itself because it had already been established long before this moment. Alexander Hayes straightened slightly as he closed the door behind him, his gaze sweeping across the dealership with calm awareness. And though he did not raise his voice or call attention to himself, there was something about the way he moved, the way the air seemed to adjust around him, that caused a subtle ripple among the staff inside, a quiet recognition that someone important had just arrived. One of the younger associates stepped forward instinctively, his voice a touch too eager as he reached the entrance, pulling the glass door open. "Good morning, sir," he said, his tone respectful, almost deferential, and Alexander gave a small nod in acknowledgement, stepping inside with measured ease, his eyes taking in the surroundings, as if assessing something far beyond what was visible on the surface. Jason had already begun moving toward him, his earlier confidence returning quickly, reshaped now into professional attentiveness, his smile polished, his posture aligned with the expectations of someone who understood how to handle high-value clients. "Welcome," Jason said smoothly, extending his hand. "It is a pleasure to have you here. Is there anything specific you are looking for today?" Alexander looked at him for a brief moment, his expression unreadable, not dismissive, not impressed, simply observant, as if he were measuring more than just the words being spoken. And then, before he could respond, the glass doors behind him opened once more, and the shift that followed was immediate, subtle yet undeniable, like a change in gravity that no one could ignore. Olivia Hayes stepped inside, her presence quiet, her expression unchanged from the day before, and for a fraction of a second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because recognition does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with stillness. And in that stillness, everything becomes clear, though not everyone is ready to see it yet. Jason's hand remained extended for a fraction of a second too long, the confident smile on his face beginning to falter as his eyes shifted past Alexander and landed on Olivia. And in that instant, something inside him seemed to pause, not fully understanding yet, but sensing that the situation he believed he controlled was quietly slipping beyond his grasp. Because the woman he had dismissed less than 24 hours ago now stood just a few steps behind one of the most distinguished clients he had ever seen walk through those doors, and the contrast was no longer subtle, it was undeniable. Olivia did not rush, did not announce herself. She simply walked forward with the same calm, measured pace, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, and yet everything around her felt different now, as if the room itself had adjusted to accommodate a truth that had been there all along but ignored. And as she came to stand beside Alexander, there was no grand introduction, no dramatic reveal, just a quiet alignment that spoke louder than any explanation ever could. Alexander turned slightly toward her, his expression softening just enough to reveal familiarity, respect, and something deeper that did not need to be named. And then he looked back at Jason, who was now struggling to recalibrate, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of realization that was arriving too quickly for him to control. "We are here about a vehicle," Alexander said, his voice even, composed, carrying an authority that did not need to be asserted, and Jason nodded immediately, his hand dropping as he straightened his posture, forcing his smile back into place, though it no longer held the same confidence. "Of course, sir," he replied quickly, his tone shifting, eager now, attentive in a way that bordered on urgent. We would be more than happy to assist you. And he gestured toward the showroom, ready to begin again as if yesterday had never happened, as if the lines he had drawn had simply vanished. But Olivia did not move toward the cars. She remained where she was, her eyes resting on him with a quiet intensity that was neither hostile nor forgiving, simply present, and that stillness created a silence that spread across the room, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as conversation slowed, as glances were exchanged, as the awareness of something unfolding began to take hold. Jason cleared his throat softly, attempting to regain control of the moment. "Is there a specific model you are interested in?" he asked, his voice carefully measured, and Olivia tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question, though the answer had already been decided long before she walked back through those doors. "Yes," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly without needing to rise. "The midnight blue coupe," and the words landed with a weight that was impossible to ignore, because they echoed something he could not escape, something he had said, something he had denied. Jason's expression flickered, just for a second, the memory surfacing whether he wanted it to or not. And around them, a few of the staff shifted subtly, their attention now fully drawn, the earlier whispers replaced by a tense quiet that pressed against the walls. "Of course," he responded quickly, too quickly, an excellent choice. And he gestured toward the vehicle, his movements slightly less fluid than before, as if he were aware that every step he took was now being watched, measured, remembered. Olivia began to walk, not ahead of Alexander, not behind him, but beside him, their pace synchronized in a way that felt natural, unforced, and as they approached the car, the reflection of the three of them stretched across its polished surface, a silent image of everything that had changed and everything that had been revealed without a single raised voice. Jason moved to open the door for them, his hands steady but his eyes betraying something deeper, a realization that was settling in layer by layer. And as Olivia's reflection met his in the glass for just a brief second, there was no anger there, no triumph, only a quiet certainty. And that certainty was far more unsettling than anything he had expected, because it meant that this moment was not about revenge. It was about something else entirely, something he had overlooked from the very beginning. "Yesterday," Olivia said softly, just as he reached for the handle, and the single word was enough to stop him completely, his hand freezing mid-motion, his breath catching just slightly, and in that suspended moment, the entire showroom seemed to fall into silence, because everyone knew, without needing to be told, that what came next would not be loud, but it would be final, and sometimes, the quietest truths are the ones that leave the deepest impact. Jason's hand remained frozen on the door handle, his fingers tightening slightly as Olivia's single word settled into the air like a quiet verdict, and for the first time since Alexander had walked in, the confidence he had carefully reconstructed began to slip in a way he could not control, because yesterday was no longer something he could ignore. It had been named, brought forward, and placed directly between them without accusation, without anger, just truth, and that made it impossible to deflect. "Yesterday," Olivia repeated, her voice still calm, almost gentle, yet carrying a weight that pressed against the room, and Jason slowly withdrew his hand from the handle, turning to face her fully now, his expression shifting as he searched for the right response, the right tone, something that could restore balance. But nothing came easily, because every option felt insufficient against the simplicity of what she had said. "I may have misunderstood the situation," he began, his voice carefully measured, attempting to rebuild the professional distance he had lost. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded thinner than he intended, lacking the certainty he usually relied on, and a faint murmur rippled through the nearby staff, subtle, restrained, but present, because they were watching something rare unfold, something that did not happen often in a place built on control and hierarchy. Olivia studied him for a brief moment, her eyes steady, not harsh, not forgiving, simply clear, and then she spoke again, not raising her voice, not stepping closer, just allowing her words to reach him without obstruction. "You did not misunderstand," she said quietly, and the clarity of that statement seemed to still the air even further, because it removed any space for excuse, any room for reinterpretation, leaving only what had actually happened standing in the open. Jason's jaw tightened slightly, his posture adjusting as he became more aware of the attention around them, the silent audience that had formed without anyone acknowledging it, and he forced a small nod, as if accepting something he had not yet fully processed. If there was any inconvenience, he continued, choosing his words carefully now, I assure you that was not our intention, and the phrase sounded polished, practiced, something he had said before in different situations, but this time, it did not land the same way, because the moment did not belong to him anymore. Olivia's gaze shifted briefly to the car beside them, its surface reflecting the three of them in perfect clarity, and then back to Jason, and there was something in that glance, something quiet yet decisive, as if she had already reached a conclusion long before he began speaking. You told me I did not belong here, she said, and there was no accusation in her tone, just a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning, and the effect was immediate, because facts do not argue, they do not escalate, they simply remain, and that made them harder to escape. Jason opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, to correct, to soften the memory, but the words hesitated, caught between what he wanted to say and what he knew was true, and for a moment, he said nothing at all. Alexander, who had remained silent until now, shifted his gaze from Jason to Olivia, then back again, his expression composed, observant, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, carrying a quiet authority that did not need emphasis. We are not here to revisit yesterday, he said, and the statement was simple, direct, but it changed the direction of the moment entirely, because it removed the possibility of prolonged explanation, of drawn-out justification, and replaced it with something far more immediate. We are here to decide what happens today. The words settled into the space between them, clear and unmistakable, and Jason straightened slightly, the meaning taking shape in his mind as he realized that this was not about correcting a mistake, it was about facing the consequence of it, and for the first time, the realization reached him fully, not as a passing thought, but as something solid, something unavoidable, and the silence that followed was deeper than before, heavier, because now, everyone understood that whatever came next would define more than just a sale, it would define something far more lasting. And in that moment, standing between what he had assumed and what had been revealed, Jason finally understood that he was no longer in control of the outcome, and that realization was far more unsettling than anything he had experienced the day before. The silence lingered just a moment longer after Alexander's words, not heavy in a dramatic sense, but precise, like a line had been drawn that no one in the room could pretend not to see, and Jason felt it more than anyone, the shift from control to consequence settling into his posture as he straightened his shoulders, not out of confidence this time, but out of necessity, because every instinct he had built in this environment told him that how he responded now would define everything that followed. He inhaled slowly, his gaze moving from Alexander to Olivia, and for the first time since she had returned, he did not look at her as an inconvenience or a disruption, but as someone he needed to truly see, and that realization alone seemed to slow his movements, to strip away the practiced rhythm he relied on. Then let us focus on today, he said carefully, his voice steady, though no longer carrying the same effortless authority it had before, and he turned slightly, gesturing toward the coupe once more, but this time, the gesture was different, not dismissive, not controlling, but inviting in a way that acknowledged something he had previously denied. I would be glad to walk you through every detail, he added, and there was a pause after his words, a subtle one, as if even he was aware that the offer meant more now than it would have just a day earlier. Olivia looked at him for a brief second, her expression unchanged, her eyes still carrying that quiet clarity, and then she nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried significance, because it was not acceptance of his authority, it was acceptance of the moment as it now stood, and nothing more. Together, they moved toward the car, their reflections stretching across its polished surface, and as Jason began to speak, describing the engine specifications, the custom interior, the precision engineering that defined the vehicle, his voice found a rhythm again, but it was not the same rhythm as before, it was more measured, more deliberate, as if each word had to pass through a new awareness before being spoken. And the difference was subtle, but it was there. This model features a hand-built V12 engine, he explained, his tone professional, controlled, designed for both performance and comfort, with acceleration that remains smooth even at higher speeds. And Olivia listened without interruption, her attention focused, her posture relaxed. But there was something in the way she listened that made it clear she was not being persuaded. She was simply observing, evaluating. And that distinction shifted the balance in a way that no one needed to point out. Jason moved to open the driver's side door again, this time more carefully, as if aware that even the smallest action carried weight, and he stepped back slightly, allowing space, not out of routine, but out of respect that had not been present before. "Please," he said, his voice quieter now, and Olivia stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the door before she glanced inside, her gaze moving across the interior with a familiarity that no one questioned anymore, because the doubt that had existed the day before had already begun to dissolve. Around them, the showroom remained unusually still, conversations muted, attention drawn not by spectacle, but by the quiet transformation taking place, and the staff who had once smirked or turned away now watched with a different kind of awareness, one that carried its own unspoken understanding. Olivia lowered herself into the seat, her movements smooth, unhurried, and as she settled in, she ran her hand lightly along the steering wheel, her fingers tracing the craftsmanship with an ease that felt natural, not performative, and Jason noticed it. Of course he did, because it contradicted everything he had assumed, everything he had believed when he first saw her walk through those doors. "How does it feel?" he asked, the question simple, but his tone careful, almost tentative, as if he understood that the answer mattered in a way it had not before. Olivia looked forward, her hands resting lightly, her expression thoughtful for just a second before she responded. "Exactly as it should," she said, and the words were quiet, but they carried a certainty that settled into the space between them, and Jason nodded slowly, absorbing not just the answer, but everything it implied, because in that moment, it was no longer about proving anything. It was about recognizing what had been there all along, and as he stepped back slightly, giving her space, the realization deepened, not with force, but with clarity, and the room, once again, seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation of something loud or dramatic, but in recognition of something far more powerful, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood. Olivia remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the wheel, as if she were listening to something beyond the quiet hum of the showroom, something internal, something settled, and then she stepped out of the car with the same calm precision, closing the door gently behind her as the soft click echoed just enough to draw every lingering gaze back toward her. And when she turned to face Jason again, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a quiet finality that made it clear the moment had already reached its conclusion long before anyone else realized it. "We will take it," she said simply, her voice even, unforced, and for a split second, Jason did not respond, not because he did not understand, but because the weight of what those words meant took a fraction longer to fully register, and then he nodded quickly, almost reflexively, his professional instincts returning, though now reshaped by everything that had unfolded. "Of course," he replied, his tone respectful, controlled, but carrying a subtle shift that had not been there before. "I will prepare the paperwork immediately." And he turned slightly, signaling to one of the associates, his movements efficient, though not as automatic as they once were, because now each action seemed to carry awareness, intention. As the associate moved quickly to assist, the atmosphere in the showroom changed again, not dramatically, but in a way that everyone could feel, because what had begun as a quiet dismissal had transformed into something undeniable, something that could not be ignored or rewritten. And the same employees who had once watched with quiet amusement now stood with a different posture, their attention sharper, their expressions more measured, as if they too understood that something larger than a simple transaction had just taken place. Jason returned with a tablet in hand, his steps careful, deliberate, and he positioned himself a respectful distance away as he began to explain the next steps, his voice steady, though now carrying a tone of attentiveness that was no longer performative. "We can finalize everything today," he said, "including custom specifications if you would like to make any adjustments. and Olivia listened briefly before shaking her head slightly. "No changes," she replied, her voice calm. "It is already exactly right." And the certainty in her words left no room for negotiation, no need for embellishment, and Jason nodded once, accepting it without question. Alexander stood quietly beside her, his presence steady, observing everything without interruption, and when Jason glanced toward him, there was a subtle acknowledgement, a silent understanding passing between them, not of dominance or submission, but of clarity, because whatever assumptions had existed before had already been dismantled. As the final details were confirmed, Jason handed the tablet to Olivia, his movements careful, his posture composed, and she reviewed the information with a focused ease, her eyes scanning each line before she signed, her signature smooth, unhurried. And as she handed the tablet back, their fingers did not touch, but the exchange carried its own significance, a quiet closing of something that had begun the day before. "Congratulations," Jason said, and this time, the word held no trace of condescension, no hidden layer, just a simple acknowledgement. And Olivia met his gaze for a brief moment, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes that felt like resolution, not triumph, not vindication, just completion. "Thank you," she replied softly, and then she turned slightly toward the exit, her movement signaling the end of the interaction, and Alexander followed beside her, their steps aligned as they moved together across the showroom floor. The same space that had once tried to reject her now parting quietly as they passed, not through force, but through recognition. Behind them, Jason remained still for a moment longer than necessary, the tablet resting in his hand as he watched them reach the glass doors, and as the sunlight spilled in once more, illuminating the path ahead of them, he exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of understanding, because what had happened was not just a lesson in business, it was something deeper, something that could not be measured in numbers or transactions. And as the doors closed behind them, the showroom returned to its rhythm once again, but the silence that lingered for just a second longer told a different story, one that would not be easily forgotten, because sometimes the most powerful moments are not the ones that are spoken loudly, but the ones that leave a quiet truth behind, impossible to ignore and impossible to forget. The sunlight outside felt brighter than it had the day before, stretching across the polished hood of the car as it sat waiting, no longer just an object behind glass, but something real, something claimed, and Olivia paused for a brief moment before stepping forward, her hand resting lightly against the cool metal as if acknowledging not just the purchase, but everything that had led to it. And beside her, Alexander watched quietly, his expression calm, knowing that this moment was not about the car itself, but about something far less visible and far more lasting. Behind the glass walls, the dealership carried on, conversations slowly returning, footsteps echoing once again across the marble floors, but the energy had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Jason remained where he stood, his gaze following them through the transparent barrier, no longer seeing a customer leaving, but witnessing the consequence of a moment he could not take back. Olivia opened the door and slid into the driver's seat with the same composed ease she had shown inside, her movements unhurried, her posture relaxed, and as Alexander took his place beside her, there was a quiet exchange of glances between them, something unspoken but understood, and then the engine came to life, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a smooth, controlled presence that seemed to match everything about her, steady, precise, undeniable. As the car began to move, rolling forward with effortless grace, the reflection of the dealership faded across its surface, replaced by the open road ahead, and for a moment, everything felt still, as if the world itself had paused just long enough to recognize what had just taken place. Inside, Jason exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly as he turned away from the glass, the tablet still in his hand though he no longer seemed aware of it, and one of the younger associates approached cautiously, his voice hesitant. "That was something," he said quietly, unsure how else to describe it. And Jason nodded once, his expression thoughtful, no longer defensive, no longer certain in the way he had been before. "Yes," he replied, his voice lower now, more measured. "It was," and there was a pause after his words, not empty, but reflective, as if he were piecing together something that could not be reduced to a single explanation. He glanced back once more toward the road, where the car had already disappeared into the flow of traffic, and for the first time, the absence of it felt more significant than its presence had been. "We missed more than a sale yesterday," he said quietly, almost to himself, and the associate did not respond, because there was nothing to add, nothing that could reshape what had already happened. The showroom continued around them, polished, structured, unchanged on the surface, but beneath that surface, something had shifted, something subtle but permanent, because moments like that do not leave with the person who walks out the door. They remain, settling into the spaces where assumptions once stood unchallenged. Outside, Olivia drove forward, the city unfolding ahead in familiar patterns, sunlight reflecting across the windshield, her hands steady on the wheel, and there was no smile of victory, no expression of triumph, just a quiet sense of completion, as if something had been restored rather than won, and Alexander leaned back slightly in his seat, glancing at her with a small, knowing look before turning his attention forward again. The road stretched out, open, unremarkable in its simplicity, and yet it carried a different weight now, not because anything had changed in the world around them, but because something had been clarified, something had been seen for what it truly was. And somewhere behind them, in a building filled with polished floors and careful appearances, a silence lingered just a second longer than usual, not empty, but meaningful, the kind of silence that follows a truth no one can deny, the kind that reminds everyone who witnessed it that respect is never determined by what is seen at first glance, but by the humility to look again, and that day, without raising her voice, without demanding anything, Olivia had reminded them exactly what dignity looks like.